Hello and welcome to Haunted by the Past. In this video we'll look at other areas of Queenscliff and other buildings and houses that spirits have refused to leave, and I will be talking about other people's experiences of what they've felt or heard or even seen where they work or live. Queenscliff, Victoria, Australia is home to many spirits, from soldiers to little girls. Known for its bracing sea air and healing properties of the ocean, once housing a sea baths. Surrounded by water, Queenscliff, Point Lonsdale and Swan Bay have claimed many lives over its long history, often ending up at the Royal Morgue. The Old Royal, first known as Lay's after the man who built it, was the first hotel in Queenscliff to be built back in 1853 and is known to be haunted by half a dozen ghosts. Not surprising, as this housed the only morgue in the town at the time. Only 50 people lived in the town then in 1855. It was also said that there was a well at the back of the property where it's alleged 2 little girls drowned. Originally a wooden structure, the hotel was destroyed by fire in 1881 with no reason found for the start of the fire. Mrs. Wood, the proprietor back then, said when she retired for bed, everything appeared safe. Lay's Hotel was then rebuilt and opened on the 18th of November 1882, 28 years after its first opening. It was built of brick and rested on massive stone foundations. It had 52 large and well-ventilated rooms and a 58-foot tower. It also boasted a billiard room underground, which was well lit and ventilated. Around this time there were sea baths in Queenscliff, and unfortunately many drownings occurred. The bodies were brought to the underground morgue, now a cellar bar, before being transported to Geelong. These included a Mrs. Seabrook, who heroically tried to save a swimmer of Point Lonsdale, a gentleman by the name of J.D. Hughes found at Point Lonsdale Beach in 1881, which is thought that he had developed cramp and, being out of his depth, was taken away by the tide, where he then sadly drowned. An Irish waiter also drowned working at Lay's in 1869. Another unfortunate drowning occurred in 1874. An employee of Humble Foundry, the 16-year-old Hugh McPherson, ignored warnings about the rough surf and went out to bathe. Unfortunately, he got caught and taken out to sea, even though he was a strong swimmer. What makes this case even sadder is that 12 months prior, his brother had met the same fate, leaving their widowed mother bereft and desolate. In 1862, an inquest was held at Lay's Hotel into the drowning of Mary Jones, the governess to the family Sir Henry Berkeley, whilst bathing in company with Miss Berkeley. Alfred Kearney, a new young butcher, also drowned whilst bathing. His clothes were found on the beach and he left behind his wife and 5 children unprovided for. It's thought that he succumbed to an earlier injury from lifting a side of beef and had developed slight symptoms of paralysis. But perhaps the saddest of deaths documented is the drowning of Mr. Lay's own 7-year-old daughter, Cecilia Ellen Lay, in 1873. Cecilia was out bathing with her governess on the 15th of October at the sea baths when she slipped off the steps, where the water was only 2 to 3 feet in depth. Sadly, it was 15 minutes before she was discovered, and it was stated in the Geelong Advertiser at the time that every effort was made to revive her. Dr. Williams worked on her for 90 minutes. Here are 3 witness statements at Cecilia Ellen Leahy's inquest. The first witness was a Mary Wood, and this is her testimony. The deceased were bathing about 15 minutes. I went to the door of the baths and heard a scream from the back. I went to the platform and down the steps and saw the deceased. I cannot swim and saw the water too deep where she was. I went on the platform screaming and called for a person. A young girl went to the nearest house and assistance came as quick as possible. I gave all the assistance I could until the arrival of Dr. Williams. She was floating in the water, and the water was about 6 foot deep." End quote. The next witness, Helena W., stated, "I went to bathe with Cecilia Ellen Leahy this day about 12 o'clock when she was coming where the steps of the bathing place were. Her sister was standing on the steps at the same time as she was coming up, and her sister turned round and touched her elbow, and then she fell into the water. She went out of sight directly. Mrs. Wood looked up and called out for the rope and threw it into the water, but saw no more of the girl until she was taken out of the water. She was only on the bottom step and never on the ground. I should have gone into the water, but was told it was so deep." Next witness was a 13-year-old boy, Philip Charles Connolly. "I was told a child was drowning. We looked all about and could see no one. Mrs. Woods went down and saw something white. My brother and I followed Mrs. Wood down the steps. My brother brought the deceased to the surface, and my brother got hold of her, and we brought her out." End quote. So I guess the newspaper reports were accurate at the time of saying that she slipped off the bottom step and drowned, but I'm not quite sure where these 15 minutes went. And on one of the testimonies, Helena said 12 o'clock. However, in another inquest statement, I think the doctor's statement said it was 20 minutes to 10. So it was actually 9:40. So I don't know where the 12 o'clock came from, unless she was mistaken. I have transcribed best I can the inquest statements, as the writing is very hard to read, and I've made the best. I could not read the doctor's one very well, so I haven't included that, but still it's very interesting to hear a little bit of description about the baths and what happened, which is very sad, of course. Even up until as late as 1929, the Royal was being used as a morgue when sadly 3 boys drowned in Swan Bay. On Friday evening, the 8 boys, all students of Queenscliff State School, planned to take a boat moored at the Swan Bay Yacht Club and sail to McDonald's Jetty on the west bank of Swan Bay. They planned to pick mushrooms on the hills and spend the day fishing. At dawn on Saturday morning, the 23rd of June, Verdon Zanoni, aged 12 of Bridge Street, James Stevens, aged 12, also of Bridge Street, and Bernard Hoppin, aged 14 of Stoke Street, met on the shore near the yacht club. In 1928, the club moorings were located in Swan Bay below the Queenscliff State School. The boys used a small dinghy to get aboard a 12-foot sailing boat owned by Albert Moden of Hess Street and slipped its moorings. Swan Bay was choppy at the time, and a strong easterly wind was blowing when the boys set sail from McDonald's Jetty. 5 other boys refused to join their mates on the adventure and returned home, thankfully. One of the boys, Ian Dustin, was not keen on the idea of taking the boat without the owner's permission, and he thought the weather conditions were too hazardous for sailing anyway. Just before noon on Saturday, a farmer, John Walpole, who lives near McDonald's Jetty, saw a small sailing boat capsized about 700 metres from the end of the jetty. He immediately went to Mr. Finlay MacDonald's home in Swan Bay Road, where Constable Newlands, who was in charge of Queenscliff Police, was notified by telephone. At 1 p.m, Constable Newlands with Mr. MacDonald and Mr. Walpole set out in a boat from McDonald's Jetty in the direction of the upturned sailing boat. The police constable had also notified Commander G. Bloomfield of the Naval Depot at Swan Island, who sent a Navy motorboat to assist. When the capsized craft was found about a kilometre from the jetty, it was partly submerged in 2 metres of water with the sails still set. Constable Newlands, with the help of the crew of the naval boat, was able to right the sailing boat, where he found 3 pairs of boots and socks, but no sign of the boys. Other small craft sailing in Swan Bay, as well as fishermen from the Queenscliff fishing fleet, were called in to join the search. Using fishing nets, they dragged the seabed where the sailing boat was found. Another search party scoured the shoreline of Swan Bay from the jetty back to Queenscliff, and the search continued until midnight without finding any trace of the boys. It is said that all 3 boys were known to be excellent swimmers. At daylight on Sunday the 24th of June, 50 fishermen from Queenscliff resumed the search. At 8 a.m, the body of Verdun Zanoni was found floating in the middle of Swan Bay. It is thought he had removed his jumper to make it easier for him to swim after the mishap. Half an hour later, fishermen searching near McDonald's jetty discovered the body of Bernard Hoppen, just 100 metres from the jetty. It is thought the boy may have suffered exhaustion after struggling against the current whilst trying to reach the jetty. The body of the third boy, James Stevens, was found at 9 a.m. near where the capsized boat was found. The bodies of the 3 boys were taken back to Queenscliff aboard fishing boats and moved to a makeshift mortuary in the cellar of the Royal Hotel, where they were formally identified by their parents. I can't imagine what those parents went through having to identify their children. Mr. A. Moden, the owner of the sailing boat, told the inquiry he was unaware the boys had taken his boat on the previous Saturday. He said the boat was difficult to sail due to its heavy construction, and for this reason he had not used it for some time. It's believed that the 3 boys were all sitting on one side of the boat when a sudden wind change may have caused the boat to capsize, and the coroner found that all 3 boys died as a result of drowning. The funeral cortege was the largest ever seen in Queenscliff. 100 members of the Fishermen's Union and senior students of the Queenscliff State School marched on either side of the hearse that carried the 3 blue caskets. In the many cars that followed were members of the sporting clubs, Masonic Order, military and naval forces, the Progress Association, and friends and relatives. Queenscliff resident Harry Mushmore remembered how, as an 8-year-old student at Queenscliff State School, he stood with his classmates along King Street near the Royal Hotel as the funeral cortege passed. Several hundred mourners gathered in the Church of England section of the Point Lonsdale Cemetery, where Reverend C. Kingsley Cole and H.E. Williams read a graveside service. All businesses, public buildings and hotels in Queenscliff were closed for the afternoon. A special memoriam service was conducted at St. George's Church of England the following Sunday, the largest funeral ever seen in Queenscliff. Flags were flown at half-mast on all public buildings and local schools, and was one of the largest ever witnessed in Queenscliff. Ian Dusting never spoke of the tragedy during his life. However, his son, Les, said when his father was suffering from Alzheimer's disease and confined to a nursing home in Queenscliff in the late 1980s, his father began making references to the incident. How very sad. Such a sad story. It seems the water and the bay has claimed so many lives back in the day when people didn't really know how to swim or understood the rip. But this was on the bay, so this was really interesting. It wasn't actually in the rip as such. So thank goodness that we have all these life-saving clubs going on, and people learn to swim and do life-saving exercises at school. It's so important. So it's no surprise then that there has been a presence at some time in its 170-year history. The first experience that was taken from the accidentalaussie.wordpress.com is as follows. On Saturday night we went to have dinner at the Royal Hotel, which has an imposing structure. We had a lovely meal, but we got more into the bargain. My son, who is 10, wrote a story, and here it is. He is a guest poster in this blog. So the boy goes on to write, as I walked down the stairs with Penne, Guido and Terry, the ghost tour guide, I could feel the floorboards sagging beneath me and the floorboards groaning above. We reached the bottom step. We didn't realise that the cellar of the Royal Hotel in Queenscliff was actually once a morgue. Terry guides us to the bar, where he begins to tell us the story of a paranormal incident which took place in the very room we were standing in. Terry told us what had happened one day when 2 men came down into the bar for a drink, ordered their drinks, and the bartender brought them over to the table they were sitting at. They were about to pick up their beers when they heard girls giggling, and the next thing they knew, their beers were knocked off the table and smashed on the floor. It is known that the ghosts are the two young daughters of the Lay family who sadly drowned nearby and were stored in the basement overnight before their journey to Geelong, a day's horse and cart ride away. It is believed that during this time their spirits escaped and now haunt the hotel, running along corridors and giggling into the night. Now, I cannot find anything about another Lay daughter that drowned. Mary, another sister, did get married in 1890, so it's not her. I can only find Cecilia that drowned, but it wasn't in the well. This was at the sea baths. The boy goes on to write, Terry also told us about other ghosts which inhabit the hotel, like the little girl who also sadly drowned in a natural well under the hotel. The well was bricked off, but sometimes a child's footsteps are seen in the sand near where the well was located. There was also a ghost on the 3rd floor who got angry if people left lights on. He used to smoke cigars, and people claim that they can still smell the smoke. I felt spooked hearing these stories. You can really feel a presence in the underground rooms and the floor above. It is like someone or something is watching you. Nevertheless, I would still like to go back one day with Terry, Penny and Guido into the basement and the 3rd floor. End quote. Another story of a local man was performing a play about Henrietta Dugdale in the cellar of the Royal when he saw an apparition float through the air between scenes, and the cast were in another smaller room where there was an open fire, but the air around them were icy cold. A lady felt an icy hand on her back. Thinking it was the performer, she turned around to ask him, but no one was there. Another story taken from DJ's blog in September 2015 goes on to say, in 2013, a lady went to the Royal for a family member's birthday and felt something was just not quite right. So she asked the staff if the hotel was haunted, and he replied, yeah, the place is built on a morgue and 2 kids drowned in the well outside. The member of staff then proceeded to show the lady the basement, now the cellar bar, and she heard movement followed by a voice saying, away, from a corner of the room, and then she reported something touched her arm. No one was near her. She later went to use the bathroom and heard 2 children laughing. Another member of staff offered to take her upstairs to the 1st floor to see the alleged haunted rooms, and whilst there she had an unpleasant feeling. Another story came from a lady named Vanessa who stayed at the Royal after her wedding. She says she heard lots of footsteps, some of which sounded like they came into her room, and then the sound of a rocking chair, even though there wasn't one in the room. Ooh. Very spooky. At the time of recording, I'm still waiting to hear from the owners about their experiences while renovating the property a few years ago. So, what do you think about the Royal? Some great stories there. I have been in the Royal for a drink, just in the back area. Unfortunately, the cellar bar is always roped off and it says strictly no admittance, which is a mystery in itself. So I would pluck up courage one day to actually go and ask a member of staff if I can go and look at the cellar bar. But meanwhile, take a look at the photos that I took whilst I was there. This story comes from a lady who is anonymous. Her story goes like this. This is a house in Queenscliff she used to live in. It sounds weird. I never tell anyone. My house was built by my great-grandparents when they retired from their farm. I don't know if either of them died in that house, possibly of course, but their only surviving child was killed in World War I, wounded in Belgium and passed away a year later and buried near London. My mother purchased the house from her mother. The property became much loved, and my late dad running his famed pastry cook business there, his pies were legend, as was he. They lived there for over 50 years. I inherited the house on passing from my mother, hence the fourth generation woman to own it. I will point out that all of we four generation of women were very independent and educated. My sister was a postmistress, unheard of for a woman of her era. Living in the house as a child, not every night, but regularly as a small child and for many years, something sat on my bed, at the end of my bed, and carefully moved up as I moved my legs. The pressure of that entity, a viable presence, I was terrified. Very rarely I opened my eyes. The room was so dark, and the small figure was even darker. The head seemingly enveloped in a hat with netting over the face. I thought a very small female. I never brought attention to this to my mum. She would have smacked me for insolence, and so it went on over many years. The passageway to my room terrified me. Even as an adult, I was terrified. I had a great deal of ill health as a small child, often vomiting at night, much to the anger of my mother, who accused me of not chewing my food. My father always cleaned me up, the darling. My parents would go to the local football and leave me at home on my own, very sick again, on the couch in the lounge room. Throughout being on my own, an intensely bright light lit up the passageway. Incredibly, terrifyingly bright and unnatural. I saw no apparition during the daytime, but obviously she was there. Aged around 11, I awoke to find myself in an ambulance. Lights and sirens going so fast. My appendix had burst and I had been discovered unresponsive. Very, very sick. My mother found me, having been aroused by something tugging at her bedclothes, she later stated. Usually it was Dad who checked on me. I survived, but very ill for a long time. Too ill to attend school for months. I never saw the apparition again. I felt her presence. She was still there, and no doubt still is. I believe she was my great-grandmother, who was very kind and gentle, according to my mother, who loved her, and quite tiny. I remain convinced that this apparition was with me because she was so worried. She cared for me and knew my health was in dire straits. I believed she woke my mother when I fell into a coma, unresponsive. She cared for me and saved me. During my time of recovery, I mentioned to my mother that I had not seen the old lady since I came home. My no-nonsense mother went deadly white. I instantly believed my mother had seen the apparition too. I inherited that house on the passing of my mother. Still terrified of that passageway. I needed to sell it after our farmhouse burned down, and my husband had not insured our house, so I needed to sell to build another dwelling. I was very sad to part with it. That is my ghost story, growing up there, terrifying at night. Wow, thank you so much for sharing this incredible and moving story of your great-grandmother. It certainly sounds like she was looking after you. It's really annoying when people always portray spirits as bad people. She sounds like a beautiful soul, and I hope she's looking after the people who are in the house now. I hope your health has much better improved since. Thank you so much. So, after talking on Messenger, she told me of another story about one from her father, which was a lovely story, and here it is. I should tell you about my dad, another sweet, gentle experience. I will tell you. My birthdays for my dad were the best days for him. I was late in his life and treasured. He'd make a massive cake for my birthday, and they were beautiful days. When I left home, he would sing happy birthday over the phone, usually with everyone he could muster roped in to sing too. Once I was in hospital and wheeled into an office in a wheelchair. A birthday cake was there and Dad was on the phone bellowing happy birthday along with most of Queenscliff. Sadly, he died in January this year, my dearest Dad. My birthday is in March. As it got closer, I was dreading my birthday. The first ever without him. It was mid-March and my birthday is the 30th. Standing outside my farmhouse in Gippsland, near his car which he bequeathed to me, there was a hanging basket there from Queenscliff. I swung around and I swear that for the briefest moment my father was there. He was very close to me. He was well over 6 feet tall. I couldn't see his face, but he was two-dimensional and shimmering. It was obviously an absolutely huge effort to be there. Dressed in his comfy clothes he loved, and then he was gone. How I wished I had hugged him. My dearest Dad. I believe this was his final birthday gift to me. I don't ever dream of him. Oh, that's such a beautiful story of your dad, and it brought a tear to my eye. And when I asked if there was an actual basket there or did it vanish with her dad, she said no, the basket was there. The basket was real, that her mother had brought it with her when she came to live with her. The Seaview Guesthouse. The Seaview Guesthouse was built in 1875 and was originally a single-storey greengrocer's dwelling. It had a veranda and a picket fence with the gate facing Hess Street. The shop entrance were at the corner of Hess Street, where the Seaview Gallery is now. In 1890, a second storey was added and iron balustrades with lacework were added and the picket fence replaced by a corrugated iron one. The enlarged residence became Seaview Coffee Palace and was the first taste of the popular coffee houses of the time. The remainder of the building is now known as Seaview House and still operates as a charming guest house today. I only have one story for this lovely building, and it comes from a lady whose friend worked there as a cleaner. I was working alone when the doors to the kitchen would flip back and forward. There were those half doors. I also saw a woman in a particular room upstairs in period dress who regularly walked from one room to another." End quote. I can only find one reference to an owner, and that is a Mrs. J. Stevens in 1909. Could this have been her walking from room to room, checking on her guests? So that is my roundup of Queenscliff and some of its spooky buildings. If you have had any visits to Queenscliff and you've had any experiences yourself, please do get in touch on the email hauntedbythepast3225@gmail.com. I would love to hear your stories and read them out on the show. Many thanks. Until next time, stay spooky.